This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, graduate students, and everyone in between, cultural workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Karla Holloway, Professor Emeritus in the Departments of English and of African American Studies at Duke University. Along with numerous scholarly and public-facing articles and edited collections, she is the author of a number of critical and literary pieces: The Character of the Word, the text of Zora Neale Hurston from 1987, New Dimensions of Spirituality, a biracial and bicultural reading of the Novels of Toni Morrison from 1987, Moorings and Metaphors, Figures of Culture and Gender in Black Women's Literature from 1991, Codes of Conduct, Race, Ethics, and the Color of Our Character from 1996, Passed On, African American Mourning Stories, a Memorial from 2002, Bookmarks, Reading in Black and White, a Memoir from 2006, Private Bodies, Public Texts, Race, Gender, and Cultural Bioethics from 2011, Legal Fictions, Constituting Race, Composing Literature from 2013, and the novels A Death in Harlem from 2019 and Gone Missing in Harlem 2021. In this conversation, we discuss the place of African American literature in Black study, the complicated history of institutionalization of the field, and the importance of memoir and creative work in Black studies. Professor Holloway, good afternoon. How are you?
I am doing very well, and it's really nice to have this opportunity and to talk to you. Feels absolutely correct.
I cannot tell you how excited I am to have you on the podcast series. I absolutely love your work. We were talking beforehand for a while. Passed On as a book that's been deeply impactful on my own research and on my partner Marissa Parham's research, and also just the kind of work you do, the wide range of kind of inquiries that you do, the long trajectory of your reflections. It's just, for me, such a practice of Black studies as a literary person. I just cannot think of a better person to have on the podcast. So when we arranged a time and you appeared on the computer screen to record, I just felt like so much happiness. Like, we're going to get Karla Holloway on the podcast.
Serendipity, it feels like to me, and I appreciate very much your prompted invitation.
Yes, absolutely.
Which we will keep between us.
Yes, we will keep that between us. Well, we'll have a chance to talk about your work and how you imagine the field of Black studies and the relationship between those. But I wanted to start off with really like the more personal question and ask you, what is it that drew you to Black studies? What drew you to the study of Black life? And for me, always the companion piece to that, what keeps you connected to this kind of research and what and writing, and what sustained you in relation to this kind of work?
I think that when I was drawn to Black studies, I didn't know what I was being drawn to. Of course, I'm a child of the 60s, 50s and 60s. So the events in America were absolutely focused on, the political and the legal changes and challenges and civil rights demonstrations. And is it going to be Martin or Malcolm? I was intimately involved in that, to the point of I was in Resurrection City. The interesting thing about my generation, I was between the children, and I went to an HBCU. So I was between the children who were absolutely there in Birmingham. My HBCU is 40 miles from Birmingham, Talladega College, and was intimately involved in the events of Birmingham Sunday, all of those episodes. My family certainly was, but I was a little bit young for that. And the threat of violence always loomed large for my mother. So she didn't send us to the March on Washington, although my grandparents were there. My uncle was a lookout in the trees for trouble. He climbed the trees. He was an icon from Selma. My great-grandfather, was a drayman for the Edmund Pettus Bridge. So civil rights has been in my family, but I think when I look at my Black studies trajectory, I remember a letter my mother wrote, this is before she was a public school administrator, 7th grade language arts teacher, assigned to teach Tarzan. And she said, no, I'm not teaching that much
Hmm.
or nicely than that. And then she wrote a letter to Scott Forsman, and then she got invited to join a group of authors who were going to create the new Scott Forsman series for high schools for the 1970s. And she was tasked with integrating the Gwendolyn Brooks, Robert Hayden, um, all of the Asian and Native American and Black writers into those classic textbook series that had been absent minority peoples. And when I saw the effect of that letter, and they gave her a lot of money for doing that too, and those Scott Forsman books, they're hers. She was assigned to, I think, the seventh grade, wherever they do Romeo and Juliet. And I remember coming home from college and going through the cards of which Robert Hayden poem should we use, which Gwendolyn Brooks poem. So those writers would not have been in children's textbooks except for the intervention of my mother. Then I came home from college this spring that Martin Luther King was killed, and my father asked me, he was by that time the deputy superintendent of Buffalo Public Schools. He said, I've got to give a speech. What shall I use? And I said, how about what happens to a dream deferred? And he looked at me and said, how did you, I mean, it was perfect for the moment. Does it, blow up like a raisin in the sun so it was a perfect metaphor for him. And that was my sense of how literature could be used in a political moment,
Mm.
in an educational moment. So I think I was drawn into what would become Black studies because of the various activisms of my parents. And then being at an HBCU when we were shutting schools down. Although what people don't know is that HBCUs were among the last to adopt Black studies in the curriculum. Our demands were not about Black studies. We were learning about Hughes and Baraka and whomever, but not through a formal metric. But our demands when we shut the school down was about dormitories and going to chapel. It was the elite white universities that were fighting for Black studies programs. And it wasn't until I was in graduate school at Michigan State and told my very esteemed American Lit prof, well, here's something. I was in an American Lit class, and I said, here's something that James Baldwin said about William Faulkner. And he said, I'm not very interested at all in what Baldwin had to say about Faulkner. And I'm thinking, what is the matter with you? So there's something about the confidence and the surety that came from being a student at an HBCU college where I didn't ever think the failure was mine. I thought that the failure was theirs not to know or be interested. And it was in graduate school when I got introduced to a linguist and a novelist and an extraordinary woman, Zora Neale Hurston, and wrote, I think, the first dissertation on her, although Bob Hemingway had just published her biography the same year my dissertation came out. And I was a linguistics and literature major in my PhD work at Michigan State. So things just sort of evolved to where Black studies centered the various inquiries that I came to accidentally, I would say, being irritated with that professor, being helpful to my father, choosing and learning the authors from my mother, who also went to Talladega College. My mother and father met there. So I was following their tradition and having a certain confidence that comes from the HBCU where I didn't have to fight through, am I good enough? Do I belong here? That kind of thing. There were other battles, certainly, but not that one.
That was amazing. First of all, your mother's role in revising these and expanding these
Kicking out
textbooks.
Tarzan and bringing
This,
in Robert
that,
Hayden and Gwendolyn Brooks and Nias Nin.
I mean, getting rid of Tarzan would have been plenty, right? But getting in Hayden and Brooks and others,
Yeah.
that's phenomenal. And I was as I was listening to that bit about your professor saying he didn't care what Baldwin said about Faulkner. First of all, his stuff on Faulkner I think is totally fascinating. My
Yeah,
Baldwin
me
book
too.
talks about it a bit, but it's fantastic stuff and really interesting. But that you know, I I was thinking as you were talking about that encounter and your response to it, that famous line from a interview with Richard Wright, where Wright says, "There is no Negro problem; there is only the white problem."
Yeah.
And I talk about that in my classes all the time, and I was like, that's a pithy phrase, and it's kind of fun to say, but when you sit with it, the way it shifts the paradigms of power and oppression and the gaze and judgment and whatever you wanna
Well,
layer into that, and you just sort of played it out, it's like, well, the problem is with you, and rooting that in your mother's activity, your parents' activism, but also the HBCU experience has given
Well,
us.
I remember when the students came from, Colby College, Dartmouth, down to Talladega to learn about Black students. This is an exchange program that I think Ford Foundation must have funded to come down to these Southern schools. I'm from Buffalo, New York, so I came down to a Southern school as well, but their curiosity about us, we were in that moment of choosing who should be our icon, and it wasn't Martin. Especially Martin Luther King was killed and Malcolm X was still there. And Stokely Carmichael, when he was Stokely Carmichael, was frequent on our campus. And so our gaze, exactly that thing that you said, was always, you guys need to go back up to your communities and fix them. It's not us who need the fixing. So there was something about that HBCU experience which did shift the gaze, which as a professor, I constantly, in Black studies, African and African American studies at Duke, Afro American studies when I got there, but I convinced them that was my hairstyle in the 60s and we needed to change the name. It was actually a moment, it's interesting. I was changing the name of the program, but I knew who I needed to be to pull along this very recalcitrant faculty who had to vote on the name change. And I was intentionally humorous. Oh, an afro. I used to wear an afro. That's an abbreviation and an informality. Let's give this a formal name. So learning to negotiate how to operate in an institution was also a big part of my work, I would say, in Black Africana cultural studies.
You know, eh, my department recently renamed itself, and I had not anticipated how fraught that kind of
Yeah,
conversation can be. I
yeah,
was
the
like
big
I was like, "This turned into like a multi-person boxing match." Like, what is
mhm.
happening? But I actually, not that anybody asks, but I would recommend that Black studies departments, whatever their names are, regularly have the conversation about their name, because I actually
Yeah.
think we learn a lot from each other when we're not fighting about which
What shall
choice
we
to
be
make.
called? And what will that calling do to the work we do?
Yeah,
So I was deliberate in saying there is African American studies that knows nothing about the continent of Africa, the islands, we know there's a triangles, blacks in Europe. So to claim that that is our field of knowledge without doing that work was anathema to me.
mm.
So if we were going to call ourselves African studies, we needed Africanists. And that's probably been both what people would say she was fairly intransigent around some things, is developing a knowledge base that lived up to whatever name we call. If we're going to be global Black studies, what is it in our curriculum that is global Black
Mhm.
studies? If we are Black studies, how do we incorporate global notions of Blackness that see differently depending on whether you were born in the United States or born in Barbados or born, as my brother-in-law's family, in Nigeria, where there are constant encounters with they didn't have the first Black phenomena, the first Black who, and coming to America and seeing our investment in identitarian work is a surprise to people who grew up in Black communities, in Black political structures. We needed to not only understand that difference in Black studies, but study it, not just claim the title.
Yeah, I mean, that's that part where we learn a lot about each other's research and each other's values, but
Mhm.
also, measure our own ability to do as a department and even as individuals. I mean, we all have book budgets and,
Yeah.
to what way do we live up to what we even wanted the name of the department to be?
Mhm.
I think about that a lot. And I mean, you've walked sort of, sort of up to the porch of this next question, because I'm interested to hear you talk about how you imagine the field of Black studies, what that portrait is for you, because as you know, the origin story of the field has a tension built into it. There's
Yeah, I was there. It
there's
was
the demand by students that there be a place to study the Black intellectual tradition so that we
Mhm.
don't end up with, a campus full of, like, who cares about what Baldwin says about Faulkner?
Yeah,
The disciplines hadn't done the study of Black literature, history, etcetera, and so Black studies is gonna be that place, and we inherit that today in terms of a commitment in the field to the intellectual tradition. But, of course, the radicalization of Black liberation struggle in that moment had really contested any kind of strict lines between a campus and a community, between ideas and prescriptive action, between study and mobilization. And I think we inherit that in terms of the political imperatives of Black studies, be committed to a certain kind of
ex
liberatory politics. And so I'm interested to hear you talk about this tension at the origin of the field that I think we still have that today,
we
and
do.
how that shapes your portrait of the field.
I don't know when I began to I would think fairly early, I understand the tension was unhealthy because we were actually producing 2 kinds of projects. I'll give you a quick example. Sometime at Duke, I chaired the universities, which means the medical school, the, public policy school, all of the schools, as well as, Trinity College of Arts and Sciences. I chaired the tenure committee, who would get tenure at Duke. Um, a funny story that was attached to that I was fairly new at Duke when that happened, and I walked into the room and promptly someone asked me for a cup of coffee, one of the other members of the committee. So I brought them a cup of coffee, and then I went and sat at the head of the table and called the meeting together. And the man spilt his coffee, you know, but I was very polite, I asked him if he needed some napkins. I was not gonna go get the napkins, but, so our expectations for where people would be, um structure is critical, and is it represent in those years, that tension was about the politics, the community. Is it representation that matters, or is it structure that matters? On that committee, we had a Latino candidate, and someone asked, "Oh, would he work in the Latino community?" And I said, "How come we're giving him extra work to do? He has to earn tenure, just like everybody else. Why is his job or my job automatically presumed to work in the community? And by the way, where is the white community that y'all, because the rest of the people in the committee were white, that y'all are working in?" So I think that tension that was indeed the origin story of Black studies had to be worked through, and it was worked through with difficulty because at the same time, cultural centers on campus were trying to find their place in space. Student programs, student housing sometimes, student weekends sometimes were trying to find a place in space. Was this the work of the Black Studies Department? I think it was not, but I understood why we were looked to for that, expertise. And that last part is what I wanted to emphasize. We would produce the knowledge and the expertise that y'all could use when you were forming the community centers or the community work projects or our relationships with the community. But the expectation was that we would choose the work we would do as scholars. That was a hard pill to swallow, still is, I suspect, for folks. But I wanted a scholar coming up into the university committee in the university program to find their place as a scholar without the cultural tax of representing whatever that identitarian politic was that was assigned to them.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it was a vulnerable space. And of course, it was a space of negotiation. One of the first sit-ins at Duke, the one after the famous Allen Building sit-in, I came in with a new president, a woman president. The students took over the Allen Building again, but this time they asked for permission. But could we
Oh,
occupy the
geez.
Allen Building before this? And I said, "Who are these?" Growing up in the civil rights period where we, just went into the march, with our toothbrushes because we knew we were going to be arrested. But the first instinct of the new president was to say, "Where's Karla?" I was just upstairs and did come down and assist, but I was seeing, "Oh, you're understanding my role at Duke in a way that I was hired into the English department, not I became director of African and African American Studies later. Um, but the notion that Karla would be there when the students protest to negotiate was a presumption that I had to help educate them about,
Mm-hmm.
both the students as well as the administrators and faculty, and that's why that tension is constantly being renegotiated. When we who studied Black literature or Black economics or, public policies were both subject and object, it was problematic. But I remember appointing the first chair I appointed of AFAM studies when I became dean was, an Africanist who was, a white scholar, and I had to talk to both him and the department and the university that, identity does not produce ideology, scholarship does. This person was a specialist in West African cultures that we needed for a department that was going to claim both African and African American studies. He's a wonderful scholar and a friend for life, I think. But the fact that I had to negotiate his identity as suitable as a head for a department without people were questioning what his work was, that was something you asked me at one point, one of the weaknesses of our beginnings were the weaknesses around identity politics. And did we have to be who we studied? Nobody asked me that when I was teaching Victorian lit. I was certainly not a mid-Victorian, so why are we asking it? And, I didn't have the exact answer. I just want you to think about, why are you asking me this? And why is this important to you? And let's articulate that before you presume that only Black people can do this or be in this department or, well, and I'm talking to someone who must have gone through the politics of that identity stuff too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we had to teach people that it was scholarship we were interested in, and in seeding the scholars who would be the informants for community work, for public health work, for political science work. That was the work the Academy did. The Black Cultural Center did its work. Departments do a different kind of work, I believe. And I think there are those who disagree with me, but I believe that if we didn't do that different kind of work, then a cultural center would not have the expertise to draw on to create the kinds of extraordinary programs that have been created through university cultural centers.
It's interesting. First of all, thank you for that. That was really interesting way of talking about this tension built into Black studies and all the things that cluster to it, sort of
Mhm.
semi-visibly, but come up in these moments, especially when you're on the administrative side, whether that's chair or dean. Not that I've been a dean, but I can see that kind of work. Um, but I'm thinking about in a previous podcast, might be the podcast that comes out right before yours, with Maurice Hobson at Georgia State, and he was talking about a similar, sort of related sort of theme, but he was talking about Black Studies research as intel for all
Mhm.
kinds of mobilizations,
It's knowledge
collaborations, and so
production,
forth.
surely.
And when he said that word intel, it was really interesting to me. Just I find that to be a really interesting word to use in this context. But like thinking about what is needed to produce intel is very different than what comes of that, what the practice is, what the deployment
Exactly.
is, what the usefulness or weaponization of intel is. That's a separate question.
And
I like the
also,
way you
it
held that up. So.
its foundation would be, Black Studies is an interdisciplinary project, but that does not mean skimming the disciplines and knowing a little bit about this and that means deep disciplinary dives. I went to law school in the midst of all of this when I was 50, because I knew that everything I was reading in terms of literature, the things I was reading I was involved then with the Greenwall Foundation's ethics projects. So a lot of public health research came out of that. But reading how much race was embedded in what would happen in public health and physicians' attitudes were embedded in that. But I did not feel I could ethically do this work without knowing the law. Now, I could read law like the Victorians did, but I did not learn about law until I went to law school and maybe 6 months in realized, oh, that's how you people are thinking about this.
Yeah.
You just want me to get rid of everything else and get to the legal question. For a humanities scholar, everything else is the stuff that we work with. So it was really informative and I think finally helpful for me to get a law degree that allowed me to read law and then turn it into a law and literature book. Of course, that was my goal, but to understand it from the inside instead of the outside. So the the interdisciplinary project of Black Studies cannot be, a little bit about this or a little bit about that. If you're going to use forms and methods of analyses, you have to know how political science does that. You have to take statistics, even when you have to query statistics as to and who's asking these questions and who's formulating them and who's in and who's out. I think Black Studies brings unique perspectives to what people once thought were race neutral disciplines.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I think it's a thing that Black Studies, professors, scholars get pretty regularly. This idea that it's somehow easier because I don't know. You talk about whatever their fantasy is about what Black Studies is, and I
Mhm.
always say it's so much harder because of all
Yeah,
the different things like the skimming the disciplines. If there's one thing academia is very good at, it's detecting someone who's skimmed, and so
right.
be careful. Now, you going to law school is a whole other level of commitment and a model for all
It
of
was
us.
pretty crazy now that I look back on it.
It's a model for all of us. Crazy in the sense of like I don't know how many of us could pull it off. So like endless
You
respect
know
for
how
that.
I
That's
did?
amazing.
I never looked at my grades because I figured if I passed, they'd let me go on to the next semester. But I knew my ego would not let me look at a B or a C or
Okay.
whatever, especially they grade differently. Only a certain percentage of the class can get an A. So I knew that if I looked at my grades, I'd be stopped in my tracks. So I just saw, okay, promoted to the next semester. I'm good. I still have not looked up those law school grades.
It's funny you say that. I was in a podcast conversation a couple weeks ago with a poet, and I'd said something during the podcast about never really kind of having the courage to do creative writing, or training. And she was like, "Take a class." And my first response was, "I don't think I can get. I don't think I can be graded." I
Yeah,
don't know. I don't know. I'm
my
so
first
stressed at the idea, but that's crazy because, of course, that's exactly the kind of thing that Black Studies is asking us to do. As you said, it's
yeah,
like not skim the disciplines; it's to deep
yeah.
dive them.
And it's also to, communicate to others outside of the discipline that this is how we develop interdisciplinary commitment and strength, by learning another I remember one of my first papers was for the Journal of Psycholinguistic Research, which got sent back 7 or 8 times because I was not using the correct statistical model for the whatever, and I had to go across campus to learn the SPSS, which is the statistical model for social sciences. I'm an English major, I don't do numbers. But I had this psycholinguistic project, which had a really interesting outcome, and they wanted me to do the statistics right. Well, I had to educate myself in that. I could not tell you what that paper was about today. I'm sure I couldn't break it down. But that commitment that Black studies, and this was in order to write about why basal readers are not the best readers for inner city school children, that their language is far more complex and interesting than See Jane Run, which
Ah,
is how they wanted to teach our children. And I said, these children are learning rap lyrics. They give pieces in church, say poetry, and learn. And God stepped out into space and looked around and said, I'm lonely. Make me a world. They learn that when they are 11 and 7. So don't be giving our children these. But I had to create a research paradigm that would tell structurally, which is my background in linguistics, why that was not a good idea.
hmm.
So I had the notion, I had the outcome that I thought I would get to, but I had to design a research project that would rely heavily on statistics to prove that, the syntactic structures of Black children were far more complex than what they were being given to read.
No,
I haven't thought about that in ages. Stop me at any moment.
no, I love this. I just, I think that the terms like interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, they're super important and they're very commonly used, and I like that. And we do think about them, but I just think we cannot think harder about that. There's no such thing as thinking too hard about them. They're just
Right, and it's
so
gotta be done with
complicated.
rigor,
Yeah, yeah.
commitment.
Well, let me ask a little bit about your research, which you've spoken to a good bit, but thinking about your research and writing in relation to the field of Black studies, you have a really enormous range of interests, and having practiced on these interests, written and
My
published.
father said I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do.
That's a great personality feature. I love that. Cultural studies, literary analysis, creative writing, social science, critical history, personal essay. And there's just putting those together to me is so quintessentially Black studies in terms of a sort of regulative ideal, like what we all sort of want to be doing. And you've really done that. But I'm curious, sort of reflecting on your own approach and what you've done, how you think it fits in terms of the history of Black studies, but also where it sort of misfits. Like, where does it push boundaries? Where does it open new horizons in the field?
Where does my work
Yeah.
open new horizons?
And where does it sort of, how do you see it fitting
And
in
how
the
do I
history? Yeah.
well, I think it's important to remember that my doctoral degree was in linguistics and, literature. And so when I think about that, which is why I was dealing with syntactic structures early in my career. So when I think about my interest in language, its organization, its authority, its deep structures, which I just loved even saying the word deep structure and language, allowed me to read in a way and to write in a way that was constantly aware of the how I was engaging the language around me. I think this is why I like Toni Morrison so much. She is a wordsmith in the most extraordinary ways. But being attentive to the word um, was a way that was the thread of my work in Black studies. Although, I wrote for the Journal of Psycholinguistic Research and also published on symbolism in Black women's literature, and my last one book on what I call my public health book, the private bodies, public how women's bodies and Black people's bodies have been used for research and the legal book, which I really stopped writing nonfiction with the last book, Legal Fictions, because then I said, "Oh, I think I got it." So it took me however many books to understand my project.
Hmm.
And I think my project has always been associated with language, which is why law was so important. Law's narrowing of the language, law reducing it to a fugitive project. And my thinking as a humanist, well, we have to understand whether fugitivity is the goal, is the instrument or the structure. Um, so this thread of language and literature have been consistent for me, but they've also been the challenge, because I'm never far away from story. So even my book on law and literature, even my book on public health, which is the private body's public textbook, used Arne Bontemps' story, A Summer Tragedy, to talk about the suicide of a Black couple and how I'm giving away the end of the story, but how on their way to kill themselves, this elderly couple who had no health options available for them, one was going blind, and once the husband went blind, the wife would no longer be able to take care of him because of her ailments. On the way to the cemetery, to their final act, they passed the grave sites of their 5 children. And that stopped me in my tracks as I said, this is where the gray-haired should not bury the black-haired. These elderly people's children had all died before them. What did that mean from a public health perspective? So I was always drawn back to the narrative, and I think that may be my weakness because I could never produce the public health textbook for race without talking about, Kate Chopin's story, Desiree's Baby. So how did that baby whose baby was it? And was a baby and it turns out the baby daddy was implicated because he was the one who carried the Black gene that made the baby brown-skinned, which allowed me to talk about genetics and DNA technology and, choosing, how far down the eugenics road we're going to go, but I did it with a story. So I think my weakness in some people's eyes is that she couldn't get far enough from the literature to just tell us a public health book. Or in my law book, it was a law and literature book when I realized all of these Black stories, we are always inevitably bound by law. So our choices, whether they are choices about our healthcare or choices about where our children are going to school or where the children in the story are going to go to school, if we're talking about a fiction, or the opportunities available to Celie and a family that was sent. I'm thinking about Alice Walker's The Color Purple, a family that was sent to Africa. Would they be able to get visas to get back? Is that an issue today? I think so. We are stopping the Senegalese on the airport tarmac today. Um, so these issues for me, when I realized that law was the tie that bound, once we decided race would be the metric in America by which all identity is parsed, and once we created structures that would constantly um, be reinforced or unenforced, like what's happening to the Voting Rights Act, our identities would always be bound up in this configuration of how we are seen by American law. And once I said that, John, in legal fictions and got enough, I used a little-known book by Richard Wright, his last book that had to be resurrected from his library after he died, My Father's House. It's an extraordinary sequel to Native Son, but very short and very pointed, where the law is so prominent in that text. So once I saw that we were bound by law, I was free of trying to figure out how this thread of the language of law or the language of literature or I was into sociolinguistics for a good long time. So thinking about how we spoke, whether a rap lyric can get you sued, whatever that case was that Skip Gates went down and testified for one of the rap groups and said, well, this is our culture, which I kind of disagreed with. This is certainly a dimension of cultural speak. But this was this rap lyric became a legal case. So once I think, I can say it because I'm an elder now. I think I figured it out. And so I finished with the academic books and went on to and retired and decided to write fiction.
I love that. That's a great way to retire into just a
Yeah.
whole other way of writing, but also, hopefully, the immense, spiritual satisfaction of
It is a
having figured out
satisfaction.
something you spent your life trying to
I
figure out.
can play. Yeah, and even though there are people who are saying who have told me this book that my I think it will probably be the last novel I write. It's called The Thursday Lady. I can tell you it's about a lady who, works for a Supreme Court justice and realizes that if she doesn't take him out, the court is inevitably going to be, continue to take rights away from her people. So and this is a reference to Toni Morrison's 7 Days, the men in Song of Solomon who revenge the wrongs that have been done to Black people. So there was a Sunday man in Song of Solomon, so I created a Thursday lady who takes out a Supreme Court justice, and then we find out what happens to him. But I've had more than one publisher tell me, "I don't feel like dealing with legal. This is going to be a banned book." Uh, So I had to figure out how to get around that, and it will be published in, Black History Month next year, and I'm excited about it, but I plan to say I already have it's a fiction, people. It's a fiction. Matter of fact, it's called The Thursday Lady: A Parable, in case you weren't sure it's a fiction.
There you go. I mean, it's categorized under fiction, and it has
Yeah.
parable in the subtitle. Well, I can't wait to read that. That's, for lots of
I'll make
reasons.
sure to send you a copy.
I will probably be assigning a copy, and all my students will be reading it and listening to this, all at the same time. Well, I had 2, last questions for you. The first one is thinking about the history of Black studies. I think you've spoken to this, already, but I wanted to ask it to sort of come back to this question. Thinking about the history of Black studies, what do you think the field has done well, and what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Being there at the beginnings when, the people who were yeah, okay, so, say Black Studies began as a university movement as one of somebody's demands, thinking of Cornell, in particular Yale, um, and the folks that we brought in to be the experts, community folks, community poets, religious leaders. A lot of Black studies programs ended up in religious studies departments since there were so many religious leaders who could speak broadly to the issues of Black studies, of religion and culture in Black America. Well, we had to decide whether that was going to be our institutional identity or whether we were going to become a part of the institution that had, different kinds of metrics of measurement. That was a hard time. And that's when think I did say earlier, the community academic tension defined Black studies correctly and also evolved from that only in a way that could both acknowledge these origins and then address how they might be best addressed in an academic environment. Because the final goal, in my mind, was to get us institutionalized. Now, Karla Holloway in the 1970s would never have said that word. I was fight against the man, the institution, or whatever. But the more mature scholar realized that the program I inherited at Duke was funded by the provost's office. And I said, "This can't. Why aren't we one of your regular departments with, you know, in arts and sciences and funded by the dean?" So I moved it out of the provost's office with the caveat that I would take all of the money with me that the provost had dedicated to it as our budget as an independent unit. Duke at that time had interdisciplinary programs. Women's studies was a program. Black studies, African and African American studies was a program. It's now under the leadership of Mark Anthony Neale become a department. But the big struggle was to get our own faculty to get history to agree that we needed to hire this person, a fight with political science over whether or not I could hire a scholar who did race in Brazil, when they told me, "Oh, there's no problem with race in Brazil," I said, "We have a whole scholar here who does race in Brazil," you know?
A whole scholar,
So
yes.
to disabuse the institution and to disabuse the work of Black studies from getting permission from some other academic unit to establish yourselves, that was my goal. So under my leadership, we became a program that could hire its own faculty. I didn't have to go, to whatever department saying, "Don't you need somebody to do this work?" So I think Black studies being malleable enough, new enough and malleable enough to understand it was on an evolutionary track, that it couldn't always be the program that was responsible for doing the work in the community as well as doing the work in the academy, that had to move again into the institution in a way where it was much more secure than it was under a gift from the provost, which could be taken away anytime the provost changed, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
I had a very wonderful provost at Duke, when I began this, but the provost changed, but he had the same ethic. I didn't wanna have to the program to have to depend on that. So what it did well in the beginning was understand that any program that could remember its own origin stories, that would had people like me that was there then, could also evolve to institutionalize itself in ways that it would be not vulnerable to the vagaries of the institutional politics. I think that's what we've done well. Mark Anthony Neale's moving it to a department at Duke. Um, Programs to give doctorate degrees in African and African American studies or Black studies or global Black studies. I think UMass Amherst is one of the first to do that. Um, those are um, the next steps that could happen because we were open enough to seeing ourselves as malleable.
I love that. Thank you. No, that's really insightful. And, I think that, in a lot of these conversations and in just my own conversations interpersonally and even thoughts, thinking about the history and future of the field, it's very easy to have, have a kind of antagonism or even kind of nonchalance about the relationship between the department and an institution. But I'm always trying to stay mindful of what you're talking about, which is, the immense amount of work and vision and that made it possible for Black studies to have a presence, right?
Mhm.
And so what does it mean I like this malleable, that was what made these kinds of things possible, but also, you know, are we still malleable today?
Mm.
And what would that
Don't
look like?
know.
I think is a really difficult question. I mean, it's in some ways it has to do, it connects to what we were talking about before in terms of naming departments, that malleability, that moment where you look and you say, we're doing Black studies, but there ain't a single person here working on the Hispanophone world, which is a huge,
Yeah,
millions of
yeah.
Black people. That moment, that's a form of malleability,
Mhm.
but also it's
So
a
that's either
malleability.
becomes a vision of the program and
Mhm.
a 5-year plan, or we decide we are not that program. It may be Global Black Studies is not our name.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I think there was not a better community at Duke than when Afro-Am met around the table. Yeah, it was like, um, Terry McMillan's breathing, the place where we exhaled, all of us coming from different disciplines around the table and then saying, "Yeah, I don't have to explain myself to you. I don't have to be told," which I was told in the English department, "Oh, you people have different, standards of scholarship than we do in English." Yeah. That was my last English department meeting, by the way. Um, but to understand, I just said, "Too old for this. I'm not gonna explain this anymore. I just need to leave." But negotiating when the questions of representation and identity are our issue, or negotiating when our structural integrity and the plans for making us structurally sound are a part of the work we are doing. So I think it's that movement we've had to take. And I think we have to be, you also asked me about things that we haven't done well. I think we've been a reactive field. And I think that we have to be reflective and proactive and anticipate um, the vulnerabilities of institutions of higher education and where we are in that vulnerability and how we will speak to it, how we will do our own, and I will use the word culling and reorganizations to make us as strong as we can be on campus. And to make it clear to campus that we are the producers of knowledge, that when you decide you're going to do a program in in the Caribbean, you've got experts on campus who will be your source. Nothing irritated me more than seeing like plans for a school in China and Duke not using its own experts on China. So it's same thing, and I think that happens with programs that are non-European and not U.S.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to be understood as a campus experts. So if the president is going to call me to the office to ask about the student protest, what she wants from me is the important question, not what she needs from me in order to mediate whatever.
Yeah.
And I could tell her, well, somebody else is actually studying student protests in the whatever, and this is the person you need to call on. You don't just need to call on the brown skinned person.
Perfect. This is such an important. This last bit is just so important. The what it means to be a department that is turned to in these kinds of moments, as you said, not as a come helps like calm people down, or the
Mhm.
assumption that because of your racial identity you know everything about what's going on, but instead that idea that there's knowledge here, and that
Yeah.
knowledge can be helpful for understanding what is happening,
And
but
that's
because
our
this knowledge is tied to somebody, it's not tied
right.
to everybody.
Exactly. And it's our responsibility to teach institutions to how to understand us.
True.
So if you come to me, come correct, come with the question about, who is an expert on, I mean, one of the most esteemed scholars we've had at Duke is Sandy Darity's work on reparations and economics, Carrie Haney's work on Black political. I mean, if in this next election, Carrie Haney isn't all out over everywhere explaining redistricting and redistribution and whatever, then we're missing an opportunity. But I think Duke is doing a better job at understanding we are sources of information for it. And the more useful we are to the community, to the academic community in those ways, the more it recognizes us in the ways that it has established recognition as institutional stability, I think is helpful to us in these dire, ridiculous, frightening times. So you either write fictions about take taking, Supreme Court justice out, or you do the extraordinary work you and your program are doing.
Yeah, this is I love this. I mean everything, but this last little bit is going to really give so many people so much insight, because it's one thing to say sort of broadly we're too reactive, we need to be more active, but the way you've concretized that in terms of that's a lot of scope. How do we educate campuses and people and populations that we are experts here?
There's a
I
little
love that.
snippet of an interview that Duke did with me and I was leaving Duke and my daughter was joining the faculty at Duke. And Black Studies did a program about mother-daughter, generations at Duke. And my daughter asked me, how do I make this work? And I said, the interesting thing is, um, instead of you're working for Duke, make Duke work for you. And that's a lot more fun and profitable. So, how do we make these institutions work for our objectives?
When I was at Amherst College, where I was for over a decade and a half, I'll never forget a colleague, I will not name her, said, let's have a competition so you can spend the most money from the dean's office, inviting speakers in our, because we had shared area. And I was like, that's making the institution work for us a little bit. It's a great reversal of
If
the
there is
reactive.
money available, it's there for us as well.
Yeah, I figured, it's all that Amherst College money, like Duke money, comes from some form of robber baron at some
Well,
level, so why not?
I love this research now, the Harvard research, I think they fired the entire team, the Johns Hopkins research, and, how many, were enslavers and they sold Black people in order to establish the university. If we don't know these origins, I mean, they think of
Yeah.
us as origin stories. That's why back in the beginning we said, go home, look at your own institutions, find out where you came from, do that work, and then come talk to me.
Yeah, not to go too off track, but, I was on a committee writing a slavery acknowledgement to go along with land acknowledgement at University of Maryland. I've yet to hear somebody use the slavery acknowledgement. Most meetings convene with the land acknowledgement. I would love to see them both be present. Some
Me
people
too.
say it's all just symbolism, but I'm like, I like symbols. They
No.
actually shape our whole world. But what was really,
Symbolism and ritual are I remember taking linguistic anthropology and my book on death and dying when I got a whole new level of respect for ritual is practice of beliefs that allow us to acknowledge a past.
Mhm.
And if we don't know, well, we all know the aphorism about if you don't know your past kind of thing, but having respect, even if you're going to question the ritual, which we ought to do lots of times, but knowing it is the most important thing. And then choosing it or not.
Yeah.
I'm glad you did that.
I,
Yeah.
I was pushing, and I mean, unless Duke hires me, no hint there. Um, but
Interesting.
I'm here for a long time, and one of the things I was pushing, but people were like, "That's too far, too fast, or whatever." But what would it mean to have plaques around campus? Because given the location of the campus and the sort of just the
Yeah.
geography of it, it's on hills. Like human beings were bought and sold on campus, and what would it mean to put a plaque and say, "Right
Um,
here,
do you know
this
the
happened"?
Toni Morrison Bench by the Road project?
No, I don't actually.
Um, it's in one of her essays, Toni wrote about there's not even a place in America, a bench where you can sit down and think about what has happened. And the Toni Morrison Society has placed benches, one in Lorain, Ohio, one on the Gullah Geechee coast. I think I lobbied for one in the White House gardens, although that was before. But a bench by the road is a project that acknowledges we need time to give space, thought, and respect
Yeah.
to centuries of traditions that may well be forgotten, but at least we give the space to acknowledge them, which is why I think the ritual of land acknowledgments, enslavement acknowledgments is so important to the work that Black Studies will go on and do probably now, and AI and whatever else is out there that I don't have to learn about.
Well, thank you for that. The resources on this and ways of thinking about this would be really helpful. So thank you for that. I'm glad. And
I think Maryland would be an excellent place for a bench by the road. I mean, they really just install a bench in a nice place on campus, and I put a little plaque on it, and it doesn't cost very much. Somebody on campus sponsors it. Um, and there I don't know how many are across America now, but I think it's a tremendous and memorable
yeah,
project.
I mean, given the prominence of the names Douglas and Tubman
There
on
you
campus,
go.
we could at least have a this, because those are things worth having
At least a
110%,
bench.
and so a bench as well. So
That's the way I feel about who I am now. I'm a bench. You know, come ask me stuff. I remember. Well, I still remember. But it's I feel more, I'm in a reflective space now. And it's really nice to have been asked to reflect with you. whom I think I already know, and we should have known each other earlier, but
Yes, absolutely. No, this has been such a fantastic conversation. I appreciate your time. As I said at the beginning, I've been like so excited to talk with you,
thank you, John.
and because of my immense respect for your work, and you know, I'll admit it. I mean, nothing shameful, but a little nervous. It's one of the 2 or 3 podcasts I felt a little nervous because,
No, you should have seen
you
me
bring so
before the
much intellectual history and
there was a
contribution
reason
to our
I was
field.
cleaning the table because, I had nervous energy.
Eh, but this is a really singular contribution to the series, and
Thank you so
there's
much.
so many people are going to learn so much from this and have so much to think about. It's a real gift to the series and to everybody who listens. And so, thank you so much for
I
that. Your
appreciate
thoughtfulness and generosity means a lot.
I appreciate it deeply. Thank you for having asked me.
Well, have a great rest of your day.
Alright, you too.
All right,
Bye-bye.
bye bye.